Welcome back to Just Facts Academy, where you learn how to research like a genius. Let me remind you, you don't need to be born an Einstein to be a great researcher. You simply need to put in the effort and apply the 7 standards of credibility that we share in this video series. Today's lesson, verification. This 5-syllable word is really important for maintaining credibility and ensuring your paper's or project's success. So let's define it, look at some examples of why it's so important, and discuss how to use it in your own research. As explained by Webster's Dictionary, verification is the process of establishing the truth, accuracy, or reality of something. Basically, it means double checking. If a matter is really important and the stakes are high, you better make sure that your research reflects reality. One of the best ways to do this is to use different sources, methodologies, and calculations to double check your work. A little extra effort on this front can save a lot of embarrassment, money, and even lives. Take, for example, the case of the Mars Climate Orbiter, lost by NASA in 1999. Can you guess what caused this costly mission failure? NASA mixed up metric and English units when coding the software for the mission. That's right, NASA. This shows that virtually anyone can make this kind of human error, and virtually anyone can correct it before it causes harm. Think about that before you blindly trust others, no matter how prestigious or smart they may be. Now let's look at another example. This involves a so-called fact checker, a government agency, and a scientific magazine that failed to verify something that an average high schooler could have checked. Back in 2012, an organization called factcheck.org published an article about the dangers of carbon dioxide. It said that exposure to high levels of CO2 can cause headaches based on a cut sheet from the Wisconsin Department of Health. This cut sheet claims that CO2 levels of 2,000 to 5,000 parts per million are associated with headaches. Having recently researched this issue, Just Facts noticed these figures were much lower than other figures from studies published in academic journals. So Just Facts wrote the Wisconsin Department of Health to see if they had any evidence to support their numbers. They did not, and Just Facts directed them to an extensive review of studies by the National Research Council that found that CO2 did not cause headaches until levels rose to roughly 20,000 ppm. Still, the Wisconsin Department of Health would not change its cut sheet. Fast forward to 2016, where the scientific magazine Occupational Health and Safety published an article about indoor air quality and carbon dioxide. Like factcheck.org, it cited the cut sheet from the Wisconsin Department of Health without verifying anything it had to say. Then it parroted the falsehood that CO2 levels of 2,000 to 5,000 ppm lead to headaches. So what's the harm? Now let's fast forward to 2020, when the COVID-19 pandemic was raging, and government agencies like OSHA were telling workers to wear surgical masks, while saying they don't create harmful carbon dioxide levels to the wearer. And what's the average CO2 levels in such masks? Per a 2020 study in a scientific journal that specializes in air quality, CO2 levels in the breathing zone of these masks range from about 2,000 ppm when doing office work to 3,000 ppm when walking. In other words, they fall into the range that some scientific authorities wrongly said would cause headaches. But headaches aside, OSHA should have verified its facts before claiming that CO2 levels in surgical masks do no harm. That's because the CO2 concentrations in these masks range from 2 to 3 times the government CO2 limits for classrooms in many nations. And at least 2 studies in science journals have found that such CO2 concentrations impair high-level brain functions like initiative, strategic thinking, and complex decision-making. Can you see how easily misinformation and confusion can spread? Everyone assumes that everyone else has verified the numbers, so nobody checks them. And as the great scientist Joseph Lister wrote, the weakness of our nature makes it often hard for people to admit their errors, which is another good reason to avoid rash or premature publication. Bottom line, check, double check, and triple check your work, especially if it's important. So, how can you implement the verification standard? 1. Check your results by using different equations and different sources to make sure the answers are the same. And 2. If you find a major discrepancy between credible sources, dig until you find the cause of it. Remember Einstein's insight that scientific greatness is less a matter of intelligence than character if you refuse to accept incomplete answers and persist in grappling with the most basic and difficult questions. 3. Be aware that you may find small discrepancies due to rounding and slight differences in methodology that can't be resolved. If so, give preference to figures that are contrary to your viewpoint and use the most cautious, plausible interpretations of the data. This shows that you're more serious about the truth than reinforcing your own views. 4. If you're working in a spreadsheet, which we recommend whenever possible, here are some clever and simple ways to verify your work. If you need a figure for only one time period, calculate it for all the available time periods and chart it. This will often reveal a hiccup in the data. Spot check your calculations with an online calculator. If you search online, you'll find an enormous array of them. If you're calculating parts of a whole, add them up to make sure they sum to 100%. Realize that you might not obtain exactly 100% due to rounding errors, but if you get a result like this, it's a good sign you have a problem. And finally, step back from the results and ask yourself, does this make sense in the real world? Researchers tend to get so caught up in the numbers that they miss obvious errors. So, apply the verification standard and the rest of JustFact's standards of credibility so you can research like a genius.